At lecture number 16, we're of course at part 2 of the navigable lectures. I'm going to pop us open to full screen here. And let's clarify this and move us here. So, something to keep in mind, of course, is that with 16, we are firmly in the 20th century, middle of the 20th century, insofar as we'll be dealing with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, and in North America still, where we will be for the rest of the term. So, lecture 16 is on Carson. Here's a quote by her. If facts are the seeds that later produce knowledge and wisdom, then the emotions and the impressions of the senses are the fertile soil in which the seeds must grow. Carson has a number of wonderful aphorisms like this. It's what makes her such an emotional writer in a way, although here it's clear that there are two things going on, right? Facts, knowledge, the basic things, the science that she will be dealing with, these are the things that are laid down, and then really this is what she hopes will happen. The emotions and impressions of the senses are the fertile soil in which the seeds must grow. She is giving us facts, factoids, scientific truths. These are supposed to, leave impressions on the senses and the emotions, and something is to come out of that. So it's this combination of, on the one hand, understanding what's going on in a scientific way, and on the other hand, having an emotional connection to it. So let's talk about first biocides. Not sure if Carson coined that term or not. Maybe not, but it's certainly one that she made famous. So she's not suggesting, like Thoreau, radical lifestyle changes. Something to be understood about this. If she were to call for a complete ban on all pesticides, it's not likely going to be well received. So instead, what she does is talks about the widespread indiscriminate use of very particular pesticides, DDT for example, being sprayed on millions of acres. It's a very different approach than Thoreau's. I'm not going to say it's more reasonable or more rational, but at least it's an approach that's likely to be followed more. Very few people are going to be able to or desire to follow Thoreau out to wilderness and live his lifestyle. Very few people are going to give up completely on something like pesticides, but Carson feels that instead we should look very, very carefully at what we're using, why we're using it, and then be a little more discriminate in its use. Again, it's crucial that she's not calling for a wholesale rejection of science or anything of the sort. People after Carson will do that, but that's not what Carson is about. She prompted widespread action as a consequence. She may seem conservative in the mold of Thoreau, something she was rarely accused of at the time, and she was thought to be radical by the people who were critical of her, especially, spokespeople for the chemical industry. But afterwards, there are some radical environmentalists who would think that, Thoreau's sort of, unwavering conviction to sort of set aside technological modernity and go back to something before it, that's not going to be her strategy. And as a consequence, though, she's responsible for creating change almost immediately. So less than 10 years after Silent Spring is published in 1970, the EPA is formed. Not entirely because of Carson, but I think in part because of the movement that she helped launch. So in this way, she's may seem conservative, but in the long run, she's far more influential than someone like Thoreau, at least in the immediate sense. One of the differences between Thoreau and Carson, and a main one, is because she unflinchingly looks at environmental devastation and proposes practical courses of actions. Thoreau, coming from this older tradition 100 years before, Wordsworth is in there as well. It's this desire to sort of turn away from the problems of modernity, to turn away from environmental problems, and instead to look to pristine landscapes, to actually try to merge into them, to live there. It's not what Carson is about. Carson looks directly at the issues. Her objection to DDT use, by the way, was that it was argued at the time that it was harmless for human beings. What Carson is going to do, and her influence extends well beyond the individual use of DDT or what are called pesticides. Her influence will be larger in that she is going to elicit a sort of skepticism that is still alive and well today, 50 years later, regarding chemicals introduced into the atmosphere or our bodies. Up until this point, something like DDT, we were told by chemical industry that it was safe and harmless. People believed it, and we just released it into the atmosphere in a wholesale way. She's going to be into the environment in a wholesale way. She's going to be far more skeptical of things like that, and as a consequence, we're far more skeptical of things like food additives and all now. These are pictures of DDT post-war world. Notice something about these two guys spraying a DDT solution. No protective suit here, no hand protection as far as gloves, nothing as far as a respirator or even a mask for to keep it from getting on them. It's just extraordinary to think about handling chemicals in this way. But hey, if you're told by the people who manufacture it that it's completely safe for human beings, then why worry? DDT is in widespread use at this time. This is it being used as an aerosol inside of an airplane. It's used to kill insects, to make sure you don't have insects in the plane, you just spray DDT. Of course, look at the proximity of the people. But if you believe it's safe, you can actually and would actually do something like this. These two women are standing in the mist, the fog created by DDT as it's being sprayed, with absolutely, no concern seemingly that there could be danger here. And if it's sold that way, then what you have is this, which apparently is a scene that was repeated all across America every year. Trucks came out to spray for DDT. They released this sort of fog cloud behind it. Kids saw this as being an ideal way to have fun. So you saw children running into the DDT solution as it was in the atmosphere. DDT is also was spread directly on individuals. This man is being treated for lice, so you're not going to just spread it around him. You spray it right on him so that the insects would be killed. Of course, this is pretty horrific thought given what we know about DDT. But again, the argument is it's harmless to human beings, so why not do that? The most common and widespread way, of course, in which it was spread was this aerosol from airplanes, where thousands of acres could be sprayed very quickly, and there's no way to avoid this. If your town is going to be sprayed, towns made decisions to do that, then you could go inside maybe, but there's really not much chance of escaping it. And again, these are biocides. The chemical industry would like to have said that they just affected pests, but these, of course, affected, far more than pests, all sorts of life. Carson's approach to environmental devastation is pivotal the word and what we mean by ecology. For each of us, as for the robin in Michigan or the salmon in the Miramichi, this is a problem of ecology, of interrelationships, of interdependence. We poison the caddisfly in the stream and the salmon wrens dwindle and die. We spray our elms and the following springs are silent of robin song. Not because we sprayed the robins directly, but because the poison traveled step by step through the now familiar elm leaf, earthworm, robin cycle. These are matters of record, observable, part of the visible world around us. They reflect the web of life or death that scientists know as ecology. Carson, in many ways, introduced both the word and the concept of ecology to the American public. It had been around much earlier. The word is coined in 1866, as we'll see, by Ernst Haeckel. But it's Carson who made people aware of it. Something like this, that you spray an elm tree, chemicals are absorbed into the tree, into their leaves fall on the ground. Earthworms, of course, eat the leaves. in the process absorb the chemical into their bodies. Robins then absorb the chemical into their body when they eat the earthworm. It's a cycle here because there's this interrelation, a little mini ecology between the elm, the earthworm, and the robin. And you don't have to spray the robin directly. The robin could not even be born when the material is being sprayed, but then born into an environment where they're everywhere. Carson wanted to make us aware that there is this intercreation, interrelationship here, this web of life that we know as ecology. And it is sort of central to her argument because, what she's saying is, introduce this material into an ecosystem and, it's going to spread everywhere. And if you think it won't, you're being naive. There's no way to sort of target it the way the chemical industry suggested that it could be. Carson also speaks about our own personal ecology. There is also an ecology of the world within our bodies. In this unseen world, minute causes produce mighty effects. To discover the agent of disease and death depends on a patient piecing together of many seemingly distinct and unrelated facts. So Carson is very cleverly talking about the fact that the body is itself a little ecosystem. And of course we know this today in a way that she didn't, that 10 times as many non-human cells reside in the human body as well as human cells in the form of bacteria and viruses. And we are this little ecosystem. But what's difficult is to understand how the effects work in the body. You have to sort of piece together what's going on, find some seemingly unrelated facts like being in an area where there are chemicals, and then see how that affects other things, such as cancer rates and all. This would be done, of course, wasn't being done before Carson, but this then becomes a project much later to understand, exactly how our bodies are being affected by what we introduce into the environment. So it is true that Carson is very much, I think, responsible for popularizing the notion of ecology. Ernst Haeckel, coined the word in 1866. He's a contemporary, basically, of Darwin. But Carson helped make the public aware of the idea, as well as to shift focus on how ecological systems, ecosystems can be disrupted. And this is sort of a shift from Hegel and the sort of traditional way of looking at ecology. Ecology, of course, is this web of relations like the elm tree, the earthworm, and the robin, and how they all fit together. Carson, in one moment, one fell swoop, introduces that notion of ecology to the American public, and also at the same time the effect of when it's disrupted. And it's the disruption of ecology that's one of her central issues, showing how those systems, how wonderful they are when they work. The opening 3 pages of Silent Spring talk about that, how great it is when it's all working. But then the rest of the book is going to focus again and again on problems of disruption of ecology and how ecosystems can be brought down and disrupted. And to disrupt an ecosystem, it can be very minor change, right? A single variety of insect may seem like of little consequence. That would be the argument made. But it initiates a series of events that can cause problem for a variety of other animals in the system, plants in the system. An example today, of course, is something like introducing a toxic chemical like mercury into waterways may seem to have no effect. It's a very, very small amount of mercury, but especially large fish and tuna and all, they can consume salmon and consume mercury, and it stays in their body. They are sort of an accumulator as they take it in, and other things they assimilate and go in and out of their bodies, but mercury stays in the body. Then when we eat the fish, then we then take on concentrated amounts, especially in certain organs of their bodies, into our system. So it's this sort of piecing together and understanding how toxins work in the environment, which is by no means a simple story that Carson is interested in. And make no mistake, it can often be very minor changes that initiate this. And the difficulty here is ecosystems are themselves exceptionally complex. So writing at roughly the same time as Carson, Edward Lorenz sort of inaugurates modern chaos theory in 1959, arguing that large-scale environmental systems, and his examples involve weather, are so complex and chaotic that they'll never effectively be modeled or predicted. According to Lorenz, and this is a famous example, a single butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil will alter the weather in the US. This seems almost impossible to imagine how, one little change like that can affect something large like weather thousands of miles away. But Lorenz's argument is an ecosystem is so incredibly complicated. There's so many components, butterflies, birds, all sorts of things, that they are constantly altering the system. The death of one creature has, little ripple effects. Goes back to Carson's image of the pond with that pebble thrown in. But those little ripples, some are small, some are large, they all influence the system. In the terms of weather, for example, I'm not talking about climate here, but in day-to-day weather, it's very difficult to predict or make any kind of meaningful or accurate prediction out by, say, 10 days or so. The reason is that the whole system it sort of confounds digital modeling insofar as it is itself one sort of massive analog machine that is calculating as it goes along, and there's so many variables, it's shifting constantly. 10 days out, who knows what the weather will be. 5 days, there's some accuracy that you can have. 24 hours, it's far, far better. And, to do this, of course, we need massively parallel distributed computing systems to figure this out. But even so, these systems are so incredibly complicated, and this is what Carson wants to draw attention to as well, that it's just hard to know what happens when we introduce these chemicals. So we have to be very, very careful when we do something like that. Whenever you disrupt an ecosystem, you're playing with something very big. So the reception of Silent Spring. Literary critics, of course, always like to talk about how texts are received, because it's one thing what the author may or may not intend, but how it's ultimately received by the public and readers is sort of what makes its lasting legacy and suggests the challenges that it had. This was an exceptionally well promoted book. Carson, as I mentioned before, was an award-winning writer. People wanted to read her books as they came out, and as a consequence, this got immediate wide distribution before it even was published. So, first, it was going to be published as a regular book form, but then the entire book, and this is would be very unusual today, I think, was in fact serialized in the New Yorker magazine. So if you had a subscription to the New Yorker, just wait for enough months to pass, and you would suddenly month by month get the whole book. Part of it was also serially excerpted in Autobahn magazine. So if you subscribe to that, you would get at least part of the book. It's not, I guess, nearly as popular today, but there's something called the Book of the Month Club, which was very popular at the time. If you subscribed to it on an annual basis, you would get once a month a new book at a discounted rate. And, these books then became enormously influential. It's sort of like if you were, had a book on the Oprah Book Club back in the day, suddenly you're going to reach a large audience. So Silent Spring, before it even came out, was poised to hit a lot of people, and as a consequence, this is going to put this issue front and center. This is not going to be an obscure book by, a scholar that is only read by a few hundred people. This was poised to be read by millions. So it may be not surprising the chemical industry, which is, brought into question during Silent Spring, attacked the book before it even came out. The company Vestital threatened legal action against Silent Spring's publisher, as well as the New Yorker and the Autobahn magazine. These did not work. Kudos to the publisher of the book, as well as the New Yorker and Autobahn magazine, for holding their ground and publishing it in spite of the fact that they were, threatening to be sued. And I should mention that these attacks continue today against Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. the chemical industry argued that the product that why silent spring was so worrisome was that the products did far more good than harm, especially good for human beings. And this is especially the case in the developing world, where DDT was used to help suppress malaria, which of course kills millions every year. So the chemical industry argued, even if they, I don't think they came out and acknowledged it, but even if it was acknowledged that, a few plants, a few birds and all would be at risk in their, the reproductive systems would be disrupted by this chemical, it would be far outweighed by the millions of human lives that would be saved. That was the argument. So even if you saw that there were some environmental problems, you have this issue that we've been talking about since the very beginning of class, which is weighing out human cultural needs on the one hand against, on the other hand, environmental problems. And this is, we will always have this, always will. And this particular attack becomes very common in modern environmental discourse. So I should note that that continues today. This is not something that was just a debate in the early 1960s when Silent Spring came out and the years following it. The same arguments are applied today by anti-environmental groups for a range of issues. But interestingly, the specific issue that Rachel Carson takes the largest exception with, this is with biocides, in particular DDT. DDT is still enormously controversial today. So in a 2005 essay, The Harm That Pressure Groups Can Do, and this is a British politician, Dick Treverne, essentially compared Rachel Carson to Adolf Hitler. Carson didn't seem to take into account the vital role that DDT played in controlling the transmission of malaria by killing the mosquitoes that carry the parasite. It is the single most effective agent ever developed for saving human life. Rachel Carson is a warning to us all of the dangers of neglecting the evidence-based approach and the need to weigh potential risk against benefit. It can be argued that the anti-DDT campaign she inspired was responsible for almost as many deaths as some of the worst dictators of the last century, i.e. Adolf Hitler or Mussolini or Khmer Rouge or whatever. So this is extraordinary. I think first off, it's not right to say that she didn't take into account the role that DDT played in controlling malaria. Her final chapter is looking for biological ways of controlling malaria. This whole notion, this is what it comes down to, the need to weigh potential risk against benefit for humanity, risk to the environment. It's a very, very complicated issue. It also doesn't suggest, this attack made by Treverne, that there may be other ways of solving the problem, less dangerous things than DDT, both either chemicals or biological approaches, which Carson was suggesting, or even something more basic. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gives millions, probably millions of mosquito tents to people in Africa every year. You put a mosquito tent over a crib, and mosquitoes don't get into to infect a child, and babies are especially vulnerable to malaria, or not vulnerable to it, but it's potentially more fatal if they get it. So this is the issue then, what to make of this, what to make of what Rachel Carson, of her legacy, and I'll just go on further here. He's intentionally, Treverne was being inflammatory. Robert Gvaz, speaking for an agency of the U.S. Department of Health, noted that, and this is in 2007, 2 years later, the ban on DDT may have killed 20 million children. Again, it raises this age-old debate. We see it as early as the Myth of Gilgamesh, how human interests should be weighed against the planet's. So it's fascinating us to look back now. I'm speaking in the year 2012, the 50th anniversary of Silent Spring. Clearly the most influential environmental, at least popular text ever, certainly to appear in the century, helping to inaugurate the modern environmental movement in the 1960s and 70s. And yet the issue is, it's still alive and well, even with DDT, how do we or what do we think of this, material? In the United States, DDT was banned. In the developing world, it has a great resurgence because it is now used inside of buildings, not unlike we saw it being sprayed inside of an airplane to kill insects that spread malaria. So, what to make of it? I throw it out as a question. It's again the same, age-old debate, whether it's culture or environment that we weigh in on. In some sense, science brings the work of a genus loci. In many ways, it brings to logical conclusion the early modern suggestion, this is made by Johnson, Lanier, and others, that human beings should protect the places that we inhabit. You recall that Amelia Lanier is very concerned that Margaret Clifford, when she was removed from the Cookham estate, there'd be no one there to take care of it, that everything would die because you need humans to protect the place. They're there as protectors. Thoreau basically sees himself as a genus loci of Walden Woods. He's sort of the Humbaba of that little woods, the way that Humbaba was of the cedar forest in the Myth of Gilgamesh. But Carson is suggesting really that it is environmentalists who are the new genus loci. Environmentalists have to be the protectors of places. They are the ones who stand ground against people who would harm places. And in that sense, the course with respect to the idea of a genus loci has come full circle. So those individuals like Gilgamesh who would endanger and recklessly exploit the environment are no longer the heroes of our text, but rather are cast as monstrous. Moreover, we readers are ourselves now encouraged to become genus loci, fighting the ambitious habit of killing, as Rachel Carson called it. So think about that, the sort of epic text in the West, one of the the earliest real significant text we have in the Western tradition, the Epic of Gilgamesh, starts the hero tradition, and the hero is a person whose main heroic accomplishment here is to fight this, what he calls, monster, and gain access to the resources of the cedar forest, which is promptly cut down, lumber is sent down the Euphrates River to help build and rebuild the city of Uruk. That's no longer the case, right? It is those individuals who would do that, at least from an environmental point of view, who are the ones who are kind of monstrous. I don't want to put too strong an edge on it, but I suggested early in the course that someone like George W. Bush, who tried to lead essentially an expedition into Alaska to get the resources there, not trees, but fossilized trees in the form of oil. He had to fight environmentalists who tried to protect the place, and in fact did succeed at protecting the place. They then take on the role of Humbaba. Well, I guess it depends on where you weigh in on that particular debate. You would either see George Bush as heroic in the tradition of Gilgamesh, or you would see the environmentalists who took the position of Humbaba as the real heroes of that story. I think for the most part, from an environmental point of view, we tend to see environmentalists as the protector of place. It's their role to protect the place, and just as it was from Humbaba, not against other animals or against the earth itself, but really against human interests who would exploit it. It should note that we have sort of a jump in scale here with someone like Al Gore, as the place is now the planet itself. We need to think globally. Problems are no longer just local, but spread globally by our oceans and atmosphere. And that's kind of, in this case, you need a new sort of protector, one who acts locally in protecting place, but in turn has consequences that are global. Gore is still very much, echoing Lanier and Thoreau, especially Lanier in the sense he is in this Christian stewardship tradition, and other proto-environmentalists. But the problem is just larger now. You can protect an individual place, and that's important, but it's, when you release, CO2 into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, and in other ways, that is immediately going to start spreading all over the planet. Ultimately, the atmosphere will come to a state of balance as to how much, carbon dioxide is into it. So you really need someone who is thinking globally to stop that. And it happens the same with the oceans as well, because you may not be reducing CO2, you may not be emitting CO2 into ocean water at all. It doesn't really matter, because if you put it into the atmosphere, it'll be absorbed by the water, and then it'll change the CO2 saturation, which then will lead to things like death of coral and all, which is happening as a worldwide epidemic right now. So what you really need is sort of a home baba for the planet, or a better way of put it would be home babas spread all over the planet, protectors of place, protecting individual places, but aware that the protection that they were offering is not just for those places, but for the planet as well. That's the role for environmentalists in the 21st century. It is also the case that then environmentalists are less likely to look to the past, but rather to the future. Certainly Carson and Gore, and we know this from their opening the opening 3 pages of Silent Spring, and the opening voiceover that Al Gore does in the film An Inconvenient Truth. They're aware that we have a belief in a past locus coetanus. They actually want to leverage that, because knowing that we think it, they want to say, well, something was lost. We did have this amazing relationship to the planet. Now we have to do something to regain it. But in fairness to both of them, they're not much interested in going back to that past. I mean, Thoreau might have been. Thoreau, sort of hoped to turn away from all the problems of modernity, technology, and go live in a place where it was no longer, where it hadn't yet encroached upon, and in a way sort of go back in time to a time before all this had happened. Neither Carson or Gore is interested in doing that, but they are looking toward the future and trying to stop what we're doing from having adverse effects in the future. The future, however, lies in the future for them, not the past, in the sense that you're not going to create a future as some sort of vision of the past. I mean, it's not going to be the case that we're going to convert the United States into something like Walden Woods, and it'll be like it was centuries ago. The future will have to be born out of new practices and new ideas, employing science. And Rachel Carson, again, even though many people will come after her and have a knee-jerk response to reject science altogether, because of what she did in part, she drew attention to, in a very particular way, how environmental problems happen, and part of it is through the chemical industry. But that doesn't mean that she wants to turn her back on science and say the science is all evil. To her, it is just a problem for science as much as a problem of science. So science, may have gotten us into this, but science will get us out of it too. It's not something that we can just turn our back on and neglect. So Silent Spring also, addresses one of this opening question we had from the very first class, which is why I approach this from from a literary perspective. And non-scientific writers, and Carson and Gore in some sense are examples of that, and they don't write for specialized science or scientific audience, are well positioned to disseminate environmental information to a broad audience, as they may clearly understand how the ideas that we've inherited historically emerged over time. They're particularly well suited to that, because they're people who look at cultural trends, who understand how culture functions, who understand how you communicate to people, how you move people. I mean, it's a debate with Carson just how effective she is there. Is she, she tug at the heartstrings too much? Does that hurt her credibility? Does it in fact give her the rhetorical punch that makes it work? Yeah, these are all literary questions, and increasingly the texts and the ideas that are spread most effectively are done not by scientists, but in part by people interested in literature and how it works, like journalism and all. And we're going to see that next time with Michael Pollan. Okay, so ends lecture 16.